You're welcome, Excellency.
Thank you. Thank you so much. The chairperson of this organization, the members of the board, fellow participants, ladies and gentlemen. I am honored to be given the opportunity to share my views on today's topic, Intercountry Adoption, Controversies and Alternatives. And let me begin by thanking the African Child Policy Forum for considering the African child important enough to hold these conferences and on the African continent. During this 5th International Policy Conference on the African Child, I am honored indeed to be present here. The fragile situation of the vulnerable children of Africa is a subject I'm passionate about, and the views I'm about to express vis-à-vis some of the issues under discussion today have been born out of the crucible of my hands-on experience in Uganda. And I guess just having watched this documentary, you think Uganda has nothing to say. But believe me, we have been working, we are still working to find lasting solutions on the Ugandan children and the African children. I have personally been working with orphans, with child-headed households, and grandmother-headed households, and other children at risk in Uganda over the past 2 decades. As a result of this experience, I do have strong reservations and even misgivings about any extensive and permanent policy of inter-country adoption in any of our regions on this continent. I am not personally an advocate of inter-country adoption as a desirable solution to the problems of the African child. Besides, there are historical lessons we should look back on and which should indeed give us a pause as we deliberate on the issue of sending out our children to the richer nations of the world. First, some centuries ago, Africa exported her young and most vulnerable population through the slave trade to Europe and to her colonies and to the United States of America. In exchange, African chiefs received royal robes and guns and trinkets. That was the first brain drain from the Africa remembered in modern history. And up to this day, Africa has not recovered from that deficit in human capital. One just has to look at the black race in the diaspora to wonder what Africa would have been if all that talent had remained on our continent. Secondly, Africa is not one of those regions of the world that is suffering from overpopulation. On the contrary, some economists will argue that Africa suffers from underpopulation. Thirdly, Africa's children are her greatest asset, no matter what social strata they happen to be born in. They are her human capital for tomorrow. I believe I'm correct in stating that Africa also has the youngest, most vibrant population in the world, with populations most vibrant population in the world. While populations elsewhere in the world are dwindling, they are burdened with so many elderly citizens or skewed, badly planned gender considerations. So ladies and gentlemen, men, to plan to systematically just give away our most precious asset to the highest bidder, so to speak, is the height of irresponsibility on the part of anyone in decision-making positions in Africa today. In fact, it is, I must say, to fail the African continent once again. On the part of any African government, it would be a shameful admission to failure to plan for our people. Ladies and gentlemen, God forbid that such transfer of human capital from Africa should reoccur on our watch in our generation. Finally, and in all conscience, we know the dangers that such children face, and once they are signed away to so-called better lifestyles outside of their home countries. And having seen this documentary, I'm sure you saw at one stage where a child was trying to kiss an adult, and the adult was taking away their head and avoiding the kid. And that was an adult who was supposed to love and take care of that child who they are taking away. Now, if an adult is not willing to kiss a child in front of a camera, how can they love them when they are somewhere else and that child is under the care of that adult? This is not to say that everybody who takes a child for adoption is cruel or is planning bad things. But it's also true that not all people who are trying to adopt these children are doing it with good intentions or good motives. I want to share with you an example I was told personally. And I shall never forget that one particular experience I encountered early on in my work with vulnerable children, which brought me in contact with other social workers and activists working on behalf of such children around the world. A particular group of unscrupulous businessmen from an oil-rich nation were regularly importing children from poor families in India, supposedly for adoption into comfortable families. I'm quite sure that the legal paperwork was always beyond reproach in both countries. In reality, these children were being taken to a race course to be used as soft balls that can make noise for the race horses to make them run faster. One child would be tied to the leg of a horse in training. The horse would be ridden while the child was dragged along behind it. Apparently, the screams of the child would drive the horse wild, and it would run faster. The child would cry for as long as it's alive, and it would eventually die and be thrown away, and then another child would be replaced, would replace that one as a commodity tied on the leg of a horse, and the exercise would go on. This particular racket was eventually uncovered and stopped, but there have been many other rackets since then, ranging from prostitution and sex slavery rings to live organ harvesting and to hard labor. And always, ladies and gentlemen, our national policies are in place and paperwork is done. A few days ago, I watched a news item on Al Jazeera TV reporting on the hatred and fear that was being expressed in some area in the world about the few Southern Sudanese young men who had managed to find their way into that country, seeking refuge from the hardship of their country. These were strong young men who had survived the dangers of crossing the desert and got to where they were going. But they were being sent back because there was no room for them. I could not help but wonder, how do the small children we send out of Africa fend for themselves against such racism in the world? Is it enough just to ensure that an African child survives physically? What about his soul? What about our value systems? The problem confronting our nations in Africa is a very real and urgent one. I have no doubt that we shall explore it at length during this dialogue, and the technical team will supply us with the statistics of poverty and inadequacy in our various countries. Briefly, we know that a combination of hostile climatic conditions on our continent, seasonal droughts followed by flooding, civil conflicts, and planned and rapidly growing and shifting populations, urbanization, diseases of epidemic proportions and endemic nature, bad governance, and poor economic and social planning have all translated into large sections of our populations becoming extremely vulnerable, with the children taking the brunt of that vicious cycle that leads to life-threatening levels of poverty. I want to believe, however, that that vicious cycle of poverty, deprivation, and death can be turned around into a virtuous cycle for the survival and development of the African child. And that is what we are working for and what we are working towards in Uganda, in spite of the picture you've just seen. And I'm proud to say that because I know that it is true. First of all, I believe that governments in Africa must be made accountable for the survival of Africa's children. For what is Africa without its children? National governments must be lobbied and pressured to increase budgetary allocations to those sectors that create a strong safety net to catch the vulnerable and ensure their survival and development, education, health, and agriculture, and household incomes. I would even propose that this august body, as well as international organizations, advocate for a decade devoted to the survival and development of the world's children. For it is not only the African child, believe me, who is in trouble. We are aware that there are places where the girl child has been planned out of existence, for example. The impact the current focus on the Millennium Development Goals has made in our nations, for example, on maternal health, is impressive, and it supports the argument that the cause of children would be well served if the world were to focus once again on the issue and raise everybody's awareness concerning the plight of the children on our planet. Governments can and should methodically and actively strategize to involve other players, particularly those that are closest to the children. In this regard, the African family. The African family cannot be underestimated as primary partners in ensuring the survival and well-being of the child, however poor the family may be. And I can confirm this because I have worked with the African families in Uganda. I have worked with grandmothers when they have lost their biological children, and instead of letting their grandchildren be taken away for adoption, the grandmothers were willing to stand up and raise their grandchildren with support from government and civil society. We did that in Uganda, and it worked. In Uganda, communities have always traditionally absorbed orphans and other vulnerable children within the extended family system. 1 in 4 households in Uganda fosters at least one vulnerable child by providing food, shelter, and emotional needs, as well as education, health care, and other basic human needs. Sadly, the African extended family system is wearing thin, and many such caregivers are overwhelmed and burdened, often lacking the socio-economic capacity to continually provide adequate care and support to such children. Extra effort, therefore, must be made by African governments to support this important social framework. Community organizations, religious bodies, and other civil society organizations have stepped in to provide information, vocational skills, basic education, medical care, and counseling, as well as microcredit services. These groups, too, often lack enough human and financial resources to adequately respond to the problems being faced by vulnerable children within communities. But still, they do provide that emotional support that is absolutely essential for the child. It is our contention in Uganda that the family is still the best unit to care for the child in the community environment. We believe in the fact that children can be absorbed by our family systems if we strengthen their capacity to care for the added burden of looking after the extra children who come to them when they have lost their parents or guardians. We believe that if the children cannot be absorbed by extended family system, at least they can get substitute families within their home countries who can take them on as their own children. It is government policy in Uganda to discourage placement of children in residential care institutions or orphanages. If this happens, it should only be as a last resort. After all other available options have been exhausted, and it should not be permanent. We must strive to keep our children in families in a community setting. In the case of HIV and AIDS, where the parents die before the grandparents, we have often facilitated and enabled surviving relatives, such as grandmothers, to care for the children, and it has worked very well both for both the children and for the old people. Inter-country adoption in Uganda is therefore not a major alternative, but a last resort after local alternatives have failed. In this regard, Uganda has put in place a legal and policy framework which is child-friendly. It has put in place various provisions in the Children's Act that provide for foster care, adoption, and care and protection. The Children's Act has been implemented since 1997. Currently, proposals for amendment of the Act to provide for a child-friendly alternative care and improvement of procedures for foster care, guardianship, adoption, and inter-country adoption have been made. Soon, the Act will be debated in Parliament, and it will regulate alternative care, which includes inter-country adoption. At the same time, Uganda is following up the ratification of the Hague Convention on the inter-country adoption to be able to work with other countries in ensuring that inter-country adoption does not result into child abuse and neglect. Our extended families are very important to us in Uganda. Uganda has always had strong families and communities, and we intend to support these existing traditional structures to become partners of government as social support systems, forming a safety net around the vulnerable child. There are many initiatives between government and civil society to strengthen and support communities. In 2011, the Uganda government commissioned an alternative care task force to review the current state of its child care systems, and in particular, the role civil society plays in caring for children without parental care. This is the first time since child care was decentralized to the districts in 1996 that we are starting to get a countrywide view of the situation. It will be the benchmark on which the future development will be built. As a result, an alternative care framework for children has been developed and is currently being disseminated. And government, through the Ministry of Gender, Labour and Social Development, has commissioned a mapping up of our child protection system, which is aimed at identifying gaps which will then be addressed by National Child Protection Strategy, which will be developed. It is now known that the money spent on the process of inter-country adoption agencies on each child is enough to actually enhance the capacity of the family the children are being moved from. It is also known from the various studies made in Uganda that half of all the orphanages we have in Uganda receive quite a lot of money from international agencies to collect children whom they can process for inter-country adoption. Many of the children so collected have parents and guardians. Furthermore, it has been established that about 80% of the children in residential institutions do not qualify to be kept in institutions. They can be supported within their families at less cost than what is being incurred in those institutions. As I conclude, I would like to appeal to all the interested people in helping Africa's children to ensure that they are not denied the right to belong to their continent, to stay in their families and their communities. That must be our first priority. The other strategies can only be last resort options. We, as governments and communities, can support our families to absorb their children and help strengthen child protection systems in our countries. For families that are willing to care for children, but are constrained by socio-economic weaknesses, should be supported and enabled to do so. I want to appeal to the international bodies such as the United Nations and its agencies, the African Child Policy Forum and others, to assist African governments to monitor and to ensure that inter-country adoption agencies do not compromise the quality of the procedures by unscrupulous undermining the core values of child care in African settings. This best interest is provided for in the laws and policy frameworks of governments. I'd like to thank the African Child Policy Forum for having arranged this important meeting and for having invited me to participate. I pray that the deliberations of this dialogue will inform the world about the future direction of alternative care for the children of Africa. Thank you and God bless you.